After you mark 43 in the Blue Book, if you would turn over to John chapter 15, that's going to be our anchor text for tonight. John chapter 15. Well, I have to say, it has been a pleasure for me and my family to be here for the last several days. It's gone quick, but we have thoroughly relished our time with Jeremy and Naomi and all of you. You've been good listeners, and that's something that I always appreciate. People come to the preacher and they say, wow, it must be a lot of work getting all these lessons, but I understand that it's work for you guys too, to be listeners. It is hard work to listen well to a sermon, but I have appreciated so much the attention that all of you have given, not just to me, but to the words of God that we've been opening up and talking about for these last several days. This is a really important subject, and I appreciate being asked to speak about belief in Jesus, because this is really what our entire Christian lives come down to. Are we going to be committed disciples, or are we going to be trying to sit on the fence, or are we going to be non-believers? I mean, this question affects everything about our lives. And so I hope that these lessons have been helpful for you. They've certainly been helpful for me. It is, in preparing for this weekend, I've really come to fall in love with the Gospel of John. I love these pictures that Jesus paints for us about who he is and what he can do. I just love what he presents for us to have in him. As he says in the last chapter, or the second to last chapter in John 20, these things are written so that we can have life in Jesus' name. And so I really encourage you in the coming months and years in your lives and in whatever you do in the future, that you will keep Jesus at the center of whoever you are and whatever you do. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the time that we've spent together. And if you're ever in the Boston area, look us up. We have guest bedrooms that have your name on them. So please email us, call us, let us know that you're coming in. And we really would love to keep you. And I'm not just saying that because that's the nice, sweet thing to say. I really mean that. We do love visitors. We love company. And this really is an open invitation to any of you if you want to come see us. Love to have you. Okay, the last picture that we're going to be talking about tonight is the picture that Jesus gives us in John 15. So we're going to read the first 17 verses together and then talk about what it means. What it meant for them, the apostles who heard Jesus say these things, but also what it means for us. John 15, verse 1, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I've spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another. If you go to the internet and you go to Google and you just type in the words personal growth and you hit enter, you're going to get a whole bunch of crazy things. You're going to get links to TED Talks that talk about the personal power of smiling, and these 5-step ways to tap into your true self, and all kinds of vague, cheap tips like that. The reason why the world fumbles around so much with the subject of growth and how it is that we grow in our personal lives is because they're looking for growth in the wrong place. Because Jesus teaches us that you cannot grow in yourself, in your life, in your character, in who you are, apart from me. Verse 5, he says, if you're not a branch in my vine, you can't do anything. And if you're a branch in my vine and you're not bearing fruit, you're going to be cut off and wither and die. It is only through accessing me that you can produce anything and bear fruit. I love the fact that Jesus uses this image to talk about growing in him and producing fruit, because grapes were one of the 3 main crops in the nation of Israel. So grapes were everywhere. The apostles would have seen grapes. I mean, most of these guys are fishermen around the Sea of Galilee, but they would have been very familiar with walking down the road and seeing a vineyard off over here in the field. And so they understood what it means to be a branch connected to a vine and growing grapes on it. And so this is a very appropriate illustration that Jesus uses, and as he does this, he doesn't just throw out some cheap tips for us. This is your 5-step process to personal growth. Now, what he does is he points to helpful, concrete things that we can hold on to that help us to realize that we need to hold on to him. He says you got to sacrifice what you want to do in life, and instead lay down your life to serve other people. And because he says that's what he does for his friends. And the way that we do this also is we listen to his words. We abide in them, and then in doing that, we find the joy that we want. We'll talk about how that all ends in verse 11. Verse 11 is how he will conclude this. And that will be so satisfying for us to read about. That if we abide in Jesus, we can find complete joy by making him our total life source. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is go to the Old Testament to give us a little bit of a background for this. Because when Jesus talked about the vine and the branches, I'm sure that the apostles would have thought about things that they've read before in their Bibles that God talks about. And so go to Psalm 80 for just a moment, and we're going to read a few verses there. Psalm 80 is a psalm that was written by a guy named Asaph, and most of the psalms were written by David. But this guy named Asaph wrote some of them. And this one was written in a very bad time of Israel's history. We don't know exactly what was going on, but it may have been close to the time of the exile, when Israel was ruled by kings, Israel and Judah, and both nations were on a downward slide down to the rocks to be smashed into pieces. And in Psalm 80, he describes a really bad situation, but he talks about what God did for the people in their history. He said in verse 8 of Psalm 80, "You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground for it. It took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shade, the mighty cedars with its branches. It sent out its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river. Why then have you broken down its walls, so that all who pass along the way pluck its fruit? The boar from the forest ravages it. All that moves in the field feed on it. Turn again, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine, the stalk that your right hand planted, and for the son whom you made strong yourself. They have burned it with fire. They have cut it down. May they perish at the rebuke of your face." So look at what God did for the people, and then look at what the people did for God in what we just read. God took the Israelites out of Egypt, and he planted them. He cleared off the weeds. He made the land good for them to live, and he put down their vine into the land, and it grew, and it prospered, and it blossomed, and it bore fruit, and it provided shade. It covered the mountains. It was big, really big vine. But look what happened. Despite all that wonderful description here, that Israel prospered when they left their slavery. God says, or Asaph says, what happened to us? Verse 12, our walls have been broken down, the fruit's getting plucked off, we're not prospering like we used to. And so instead of blessing and nourishment, this vine is starting to go away. This vine is getting ravaged. This vine is not going to survive, and it's because of sin. The Israelites sinned. The nations all around them said, hey, we've got these great idols, and we've got these great religious ideas of sleeping with people who are not you're not married to, and offering your children to the fire. And Israelites looked at all these countries and said, that's a great idea. And so that's why they're destroyed. And so many passages get into that. So Israel failed to be God's vine. And they failed to prosper. And Jeremiah, the prophet, talks about this as well. Go to Jeremiah chapter 5 for just a moment. Jeremiah chapter 5, beginning in verse 10. Jeremiah is talking about what's going on in Judah, the country that he is prophesying in. And Jeremiah is the last prophet to preach to the people before Judah gets sucked out of their country by the Babylonians, who come in and just destroy everything. And so God, in his great mercy, don't let anybody tell you that the God of the Old Testament was mean and nasty and unmerciful, because the prophet Jeremiah is a testament to the fact that he is full of mercy. Because he has sent prophet after prophet after prophet, and they've killed them, or they've ignored them, they've done things to them. But he sends another one, the last one, Jeremiah, in the last days of the country, to say, guys, this is your last chance. Please stop sinning. Otherwise, God's going to flatten you. So turn around and repent. Now, look at what Jeremiah says. These are the words of God through him. He says, go up through her vine rows and destroy, but make not a full end. Strip away her branches, for they are not the Lord's. For the house of Israel and the house of Judah have been utterly treacherous to me, declares the Lord. And in chapter 6, in verse 9. Thus says the Lord of hosts, they shall glean thoroughly as a vine, the remnant of Israel. Like a grape gatherer, pass your hand again over its branches. And so Israel has failed to be God's true vine, to bear the kind of fruit that he wanted from his people. They're not the light of the world, like God wanted them to be. Remember, Jesus said that the temple in Jerusalem was supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations. But all the nations in Israel's history looked at the Jews and said, really? You're supposed to be God's people? You're acting like everybody else does. You're not holy. You're not righteous. And so God destroys them. And yes, he brings them back to their land, but they still have problems with sin, even after that. And so they failed to be God's true vine, but then Jesus comes along and he says, I am the true vine. Not like the vine of Israel that didn't fulfill its purpose. They failed, but Jesus succeeds in what he has come to do. He kept, as he says here in John 15, he kept his Father's commandments and abided in his love, unlike what the Jews did, unlike what Israel and Judah did. He was the true source of justice and life, unlike the rest of Abraham's family. And all nations of the world were blessed through Jesus, unlike what happened with the Jews. He was the temple that could not be destroyed. Even though Solomon's temple was destroyed, Zerubbabel's temple was knocked down, Herod's temple would be built, but Herod's temple was going to be destroyed. Jesus is the true temple that lasted into eternity and is our temple today. And so Jesus is bringing all this into this discussion in John 15 when he says he's true and he is the vine that they can bear fruit in. And so I want to talk about what it means for the apostles and for us to bear fruit in Jesus. How does that work? Well, look at verse 2. He mentions, since he is the true vine, his Father is the vine dresser. His Father is the one with the clippers who's going through the vine. And he says in verse 2, what my Father is going to do is he's going to go through the vine with the clippers, and he's going to chop off the branches that don't do anything, that aren't bearing fruit, or for the ones that are, he's going to trim them so that they will bear more fruit and be more productive than they were before. I love this image of the vine and the branches. I just want to mention really quickly, it's very important for us to understand what Jesus is talking about here. He's not saying that he is the vine and the branches are all the local churches and denominations out in the religious world. That's the way some people take this passage. And he's not saying that the vine is the church and the branches are the people who make up the church. No, he's saying, I am the vine, verse 5, I am the vine, and you all individually are the branches that are part of this vine. Jesus will always remain, but sometimes the branches can be pruned off, or they can bear fruit, or die, or get pruned. But I love what he says about pruning here. I don't know how many of you have experience with gardens and pruning. I don't have a whole lot, but from what I have read, especially if you have something like a rose bush, your rose bush is not, if you just leave it alone and it just grows for years and years over here in your garden, pretty soon it's going to start producing shrimpy little flowers. And it's going to grow tangly, and it's going to grow in on itself and scraggly, and it's not going to be this beautiful rose bush that you want it to be like. And so you have to go in there on a regular basis and trim off things that are not growing the way that they should so that it can produce the big, beautiful flowers that you want from it. Well, I would imagine, I don't have experience trimming grapevines, but I would imagine it's pretty much the same principle, that you need to go in there and surgically remove things that should not belong to help it grow with the right direction and the right purpose. And God did that with the apostles. And God does that with us. Now think about how he did that with the people who are listening to this. You have Peter in the audience. Did Peter need pruning? You think about what happens even into the book of Acts. When Peter got up and he preached on the day of Pentecost that everybody who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, he said that, but he didn't really understand what he was talking about. Because even when he said that in Acts 2, he still thought only Jews can be Christians. We can't have all these other uncircumcised people in the kingdom of God. I mean, they got to become Jews first before we let them in here. But you get all the way into Acts 10, and God prunes Peter, doesn't he? He gets this sheet full of all these animals, and he puts it down in front of Peter, and he says, hey, kill those unclean animals and eat them up. Peter says, no, I can't do that. I've never done something like that. I'm pure, I'm holy, I keep the law. And God says, what I declare clean, you don't call unholy. You kill and you eat those animals. And that happens several times, and the sheet gets taken back up, and then pretty soon there's a knock on his door, and it's a messenger to take him to the house of a Roman soldier. And he gets to the house, and there's the Roman soldier, Cornelius, and all of his family and friends, no doubt, they're all Romans too, into that room. And Peter walks in, and he says, you know, God just showed me not too long ago that I had some better thinking to do. Now, Peter had an attitude about the gospel that did not belong in his head, and God pruned it out. So you had things like that happened throughout the book of Acts. But God prunes us too. This is not just a message that only applied to the apostles. It did apply to them. But think about how God prunes us. You know, my parents were good parents. They worked hard in trying to raise us kids. Me and my three siblings. But there are things that I have to prune out of my life, that I have the attitudes in me that I had growing up that don't really belong in the life of a Christian, that God is still working on me with to take out of my life, that were a result of my upbringing. And maybe you have baggage from the way that you were raised in your home. You know, our parents are good parents, but they're not necessarily perfect. And I know I'm not going to be a perfect parent to my girls either. And I'm depending on God to prune them and to work on their lives to make up for my deficiencies as a parent. That happens to all of us. We need to be able to listen to the rebukes of other people. When they come to us and they open God's words to us, we need to be able to listen to the words of God and change. Because that is a way that God prunes us. We need to be able to learn the right lessons through suffering pain. When you suffer, when I suffer, if we just complain the entire time, we're not going to learn anything from that. We're not going to be pruned. We're not going to be changed. We're just going to be complainers. And we're going to get into that habit. We need to not ignore the parts of Scripture that are hard to read or that are painful for us to study, because that is how God prunes our hearts and our lives to be closer to Him. So whatever deeply rooted attitudes that do not belong, however they got there, whether it was from our upbringing or it was some experience that we had in the world, whatever it was, if we've got racism, if we've got apathy, if we've got selfishness, if we've got pride, whatever is in our heart and our mind that does not belong, we have to let God prune it out, so that you can become more productive. Hebrews 12 in verse 11 says this, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant," and I think we can all understand that, "but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." So if we're going to bear fruit in Jesus, part of what that means is humbly submitting to times of pruning and clipping and discipline when God takes what is within us and gently but firmly takes it out of us and replaces it with something better. And part of the way that he does that is he allows his words to take up residence in us, and we need to be receptive to that. Notice in verse 3, in verse 7, notice how he says in verse 3, "Already you are clean." Why? Because they took a bath? No. "Because of the word that I have spoken to you." And then in verse 7, he'll talk about his words as well. "If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you." Remember how John introduced the gospel to us. He talks about Jesus as the Word, which created everything in the world. Nothing was made except for Jesus operating on it and creating it in our life. The Word took on human flesh, and Jesus spoke his words to his people so that they would have life. And so in verse 3, he says, you've heard what I've said. Throughout the 3 years that I've spent with you, you've had conversations with me. You've been up there on the mountain and on the plain. Wherever I preached a sermon, you heard those things. You were with me and at that time. So you're clean because you've listened to what I had to say, and those words are rolling around in your mind and your heart. They remembered those things long after Jesus left the earth. In fact, in John 6:68, when Jesus was talking about how he's the bread of life, remember at the end of that passage, everybody else leaves. The crowd, he had a big crowd, the whole crowd leaves except for the apostles, and God says, or Jesus says, "Okay, you're going to leave too?" And Peter says, "No, we look at you and we see that you have the words of life," John 6:68. And in verse 7 of what we just read here in John 15, we get insight into how the apostles can bear fruit. Notice the word abide. The word abide in John 15 pops up so many times in this passage. What does that word mean? What does that imply to you when you see the word abide? It means to stay. It means to remain. It means to not be bouncing around in other places, but to stay put in this one location. So that's what he's saying. You need to abide, you need to stay, remain inside of my words, because they're unlike any other. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who actually wasn't here in this scene when Jesus spoke these words, but Jesus appeared to him. The Apostle Paul even said in Acts 20:35, "Remember the words of the Lord Jesus." And he gave an example how he himself said, "It's more blessed to give than to receive." So the apostles remembered the words, and they spoke them regularly to other Christians. And if we want to be productive in the kingdom, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to read our Bibles like they did. We're going to talk about Jesus like they did. When we get together with each other, we're going to have conversations about the gospel. We're not just going to talk about the Blue Jays, or in my case, the Red Sox, or the Patriots, or any other sports team. Those things are fine. Those things are entertaining, and that's good. But we need to not stay on the surface in our relationships with each other. We got to be more deep than that. We got to talk about Jesus' words. We got to look at each other across the table and say, I was reading in John 12 the other day, and I found this neat phrase and this neat idea that Jesus talked about We need to be sharing with each other about the Bible, because that is going to draw us closer than any discussion about a sports team will. So we need to abide in the words of God and of Jesus. And something else that he points out that is going to help us to bear fruit in him is we need to give up our lives in radically loving each other with a focus on sacrifice. I want you to read 9 through 13 with me again. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, then you'll abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. And these things I have spoken, that your joy may be full. Verse 12, this is my command that I'm giving to you, that you love each other just like I've loved you. And then verse 13, one of the most famous verses of this chapter, greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. You know, have you ever thought about the fact that love is the way that the Christian life is really all summed up as? The greatest law in the Old Testament, when Jesus was approached by somebody who was trying to trick him, trap him in his words, and he said, what's the greatest thing in the law? You know, of all the different laws that you can read about, what is the one thing that I need to do? And Jesus says, okay, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Both of those commands have to do with love. That's what they have in common. Love God, love other people. That's the whole point. And in 1 Corinthians 13, when the Apostle Paul is talking about all the things that he could do to show that he's really spiritual, he could give his body up to be burned, and people did that. He could sell all of his possessions and give them to poor people, and people did that, and that's good. But he said, you know, if I do all those things, if I move mountains with my faith, like Jesus said we could, if I do all those things and I don't care about other people and I don't care about loving God, then all of that is for nothing. None of it matters at all. And you notice, I don't know if you noticed this, but in verses 9 through 13, Jesus uses the word love 8 times. It just saturates these verses because he talks about his Father's love toward him. He talks about his love toward the Father. He talks about his love to the apostles, and the apostles, how they should love each other. Love is all over the place. But what did the apostles struggle with when Jesus was on the earth doing his ministry? What was the argument that they kept having with each other? Who's the greatest? Who's the best? You know, Peter, would have looked over at Matthew and said, Peter, Matthew, I did some things with Jesus you didn't do. I think I'm the best. Well, Matthew, he called me. I'm a tax collector. You're a fisherman. I'm worth more than you are. They had silly, stupid arguments with each other constantly. In fact, Luke tells us in Luke 22, in verse 24, when they were sitting at the Lord's Supper table. Now this is something I missed for years. But in Luke 22, he tells us as they're sitting at the Lord's Supper table, they're having the same argument of who's the greatest. And there's no doubt, when they're all sitting at that table, who is the greatest? The Master. Jesus was the greatest. But how did he show he was the greatest? Did he say, well, I did a lot more miracles than you did? No, he got down and he dressed himself like a servant and he washed their feet. He even washed Judas's feet. There's no indication that he did not wash Judas's feet. He became their servant because he loved them. And Jesus says here, you got to love each other like I've loved you. That's what it's all about. That's how we bear fruit. What would churches look like if this happened? This really happened. If instead of waiting for other people to serve us, we went out Regardless of what the Christians in the congregation do for us, we go out and we serve each other. What would this church be like? Do we have the attitude of, well, last time I was sick, I didn't get a call. Last time I was sick, I didn't get food brought to me, or I didn't get a card, or something happened to me, and nobody, or this person, or that person didn't show love when I went through this situation, so I'm sure not going to help them. If we didn't have attitudes like that, what would a church look like if we truly loved each other? What would a marriage look like if one spouse didn't say, okay, I'll go 50% and then I'll stop at 50%, and I'm going to wait for the other spouse to come 50% and meet me at the middle, and if that doesn't happen, that's their fault. What would a marriage look like if one spouse said, I'm going to go 100% regardless of what my spouse does? Love does not depend on how the other person treats us. Because if it did, Jesus would not die on the cross for us. We would be up a creek without a paddle, and the devil would still have us. But loving others as Jesus loved us demands that we sacrifice every single day. And it might involve sacrificing our physical lives, and taking a bullet for a brother, and laying down your life for your friend. He talks about that. He's going to do that. We might have to do that in a situation, but short of that, every single day that God gives us, we have to be showing this love to each other. It's how we bear fruit. It's how we abide in Jesus. We abide in His love. And something else that's really important about this passage that we're looking at right now, and Jeremy has been touching on this in the songs that we sang before we started our service, is that bearing fruit in Jesus involves completely obeying the commands that He gives. That's what He says in verse 10 and verse 12. His commandments are what they need to be keeping. And verse 12, He says what His commandment is. It is love, that you love one another. You know, in our culture, and I don't know if it's the same way up here in Canada, but in the United States, the words obedience and the words commands, the word command is a nasty word. Because for some people it just means being like a robot and mindlessly obeying something, becoming the slave of somebody else, performing their will. But for many people, commands are just for servants and people who don't have any freedom. Commands are for people who don't have independence. But charting your own course and being independent is what is glorified and is what is appreciated. And perhaps even for us as Christians, we might fall into the idea that commands are really for the Old Testament time. That's not for us. The Jews had the 10 Commandments and all the other laws that they had to keep. But in the new covenant with Jesus, we're different from that. We don't have to dress up and fry animals on the altar. We are living under grace, not under law. And that's true. We are. But does that mean that we don't have commands from God? No, absolutely not. Jesus says, if you obey my commandments, that's how you show that you're one of my disciples. John 14:15, if you love me, you will give me whatever gift that you see fit. No, you will keep my commandments. Now, they're not the same commandments. Jesus doesn't command us, put tassels on your garments and bind certain things on your hands and do certain things that He told the Jews to do, offer up pigeons and lambs and animals in sacrifice and smear blood over everything. No, we're not commanded to do that, but we do have commands. But those commands are for our joy, not for our harm. Obedience is only harmful when the master who's giving you commands is incompetent or does not have your best interest at heart, doesn't care about you or what happens in your life. But we have no better master than in Jesus Christ that we serve. When Jesus commands us to do something, it's for His glory and our good, regardless of whether we understand it or not. Because, verse 10, Jesus said He kept His Father's commands, and what did that do for Him? Somebody might say, well, it led to the cross. It led to His pain and His suffering. But through the cross, what happened to Jesus? He's in glory. He is sitting at the right hand of Father God at this very moment as I'm speaking. Keeping the Father's commands was a good thing for Jesus. So we should look at the Father's commands as good for us. Even in the hardest moments, when we look at a command and we say, oh, do I really need to follow that? I'm in this relationship with this woman and I love her and I want to marry her, and Jesus says this about marriage and divorce. I don't want to do that. But His commands are for our good. We need to trust that. And the command here, again, is love. Not a love that we can fall into or fall out of, but a love that is driven by obedience, which leads to joy. And that's really what He offers us in this passage. That's what verse 11 is all about. These things I have spoken to you. Here's the point, Jesus says, of all of this image about vine and branches and bearing fruit. These things I have spoken, that my joy may be inside of you, in you, and that your joy may be full. This is our purpose statement. And as Jesus sat with His apostles at the Lord's Supper table, and by the way, that is what's happening in John 15. Judas has left the table, and the betrayal is about to happen. But in John 15, he is still sitting at that table after they have been arguing with each other about who's the greatest. And He's telling them, I'm going to tell you how you get joy and satisfaction. It's not through this nonsense. It's through loving other people, denying yourself to follow me, to follow Jesus, He says. So they could look back on these things and be encouraged as Jesus went to the cross. This is how they grow. This is what personal growth really means. It's finding your growth in Jesus.